The story begins in the lobby of the Davidson County Courthouse, where authority and tension collide. Officer Bradley Thompson, a 12-year veteran of courthouse security, was already on edge when his patience snapped. Without warning, he struck a woman across the face with an open palm. The sharp crack of skin against skin echoed through the marble hall like a gunshot, silencing conversations and drawing every eye toward the scene. The woman, Margaret Sullivan, was 55 years old. To Thompson, she was nothing more than another nuisance, someone wasting his time with excuses. He dismissed her as insignificant, a faceless member of the public he believed he had power over. In that moment, his expression betrayed something chilling. He enjoyed the act. Watching her head whip to the side under the force of his blow, he felt satisfaction, as though he had reasserted control in front of the growing crowd. But Thompson had no idea what he had just unleashed. Within less than a minute, the same woman he treated with contempt would speak 3 simple words that would dismantle his career, ruin his reputation, and ripple across the justice system itself. Those words would drag him to his knees begging for mercy, a mercy he had denied to others countless times. This moment, which appeared to be a routine display of authority, would instead become the most catastrophic mistake of his professional life. What began as a flash of arrogance and violence was about to transform into a story of accountability, justice, and the exposure of deep-seated abuse of power. Margaret Sullivan approached the courthouse with quiet confidence. The October morning air was cool as she climbed the wide stone steps of the Davidson County Courthouse in Nashville, Tennessee. She carried a worn leather briefcase in one hand, a companion she had relied on for years, and wore a simple navy dress that gave her a professional but understated appearance. At 55, her posture was upright, her movements steady, and her silver hair was gathered neatly into a bun. To the casual observer, she looked like countless other citizens arriving at the courthouse that morning. Ordinary, unremarkable, and routine. Inside, Officer Bradley Thompson leaned lazily against the security checkpoint. A 12-year veteran of courthouse security, he had long since grown bored with the daily grind of checking bags and waving people through metal detectors. This morning his attention wasn't on the visitors filing in. Instead, he was scrolling through his phone, grumbling to himself about yet another early shift. When Margaret stepped forward, Thompson didn't even glance at her. Without lifting his eyes from the screen, he barked, "Ma'am, empty your pockets." His tone was sharp, more command than courtesy. Margaret, unfazed, placed her keys and phone into the plastic bin with quiet precision. "Certainly, officer," she replied in a calm voice. Her politeness should have diffused the tension, but instead it irritated him. To Thompson, people who were excessively courteous always had something to hide. He had seen it before, or so he believed. When she walked through the metal detector, the machine gave a faint beep. Thompson immediately straightened and snapped, "Step back." His phone slid into his pocket as his eyes narrowed on her. "What's in the briefcase?" he demanded. "Legal documents for this morning's proceedings," Margaret answered evenly. Her tone was steady, her words simple, but her composure only deepened Thompson's suspicions. He didn't like vague answers, and hers felt evasive. He had dealt with plenty of people trying to sneak into courtrooms without proper authorization, and in his mind, this was just another case. "What kind of documents?" "You a lawyer?" His voice dripped with skepticism. "I have business in the courthouse today." "Yes," she said firmly, refusing to let his aggression rattle her. The non-specific response was enough for Thompson to decide she was hiding something. He stepped closer, puffing up with authority. "Open the briefcase now." Margaret hesitated only for a moment. She lifted her gaze to meet his and said softly, "Officer, I assure you these are legitimate court papers." "I said open it," he barked, his voice booming across the lobby. Heads turned. A few early visitors paused to watch the exchange. Reluctantly, Margaret set the briefcase on the table and opened it, revealing neatly stacked files, bound legal documents, and correspondence. The papers were orderly, professional, and authentic, yet Thompson was far from convinced. He snatched up a folder and flipped through the pages carelessly, as though rifling through the evidence of a crime. "These look official," he said mockingly. "A little too official for someone like you. Where'd you get them? Steal them from a law office?" Margaret's jaw tightened. She had remained composed until this moment, but the insult struck a nerve. Still, she kept her tone low and deliberate. "Officer Thompson," she began, reading his name from his badge. "I can explain if you'll just—" But he cut her off with a harsh laugh. "Now you're trying to butter me up? What's your angle here, lady?" The crowd of onlookers was growing. Lawyers, clerks, and curious citizens slowed their pace, drawn by the tension unfolding before them. Thompson, however, thrived on the attention. Every word he spoke was louder than the last, his authority on full display. "You know what I think?" he continued, puffing out his chest. "I think you're a scammer, trying to forge documents, pass yourself off as someone you're not. We see people like you all the time." Margaret's expression remained calm, though her jaw set just a little tighter. "Officer, if you would just check your morning roster—" "Don't tell me how to do my job," Thompson snapped, cutting her off again. His voice cracked like a whip, drawing stares from every corner of the lobby. The tension was now electric. Margaret stood dignified but cornered, while Thompson pressed harder, fueled by arrogance and the thrill of an audience. In his mind, this was no longer just a routine security check. It was a performance, and he was the man in charge. What neither he nor the crowd yet realized was that this seemingly trivial confrontation was about to explode into a moment that would be remembered for years. The officer's arrogance, the woman's patience, the watching eyes of the courthouse, all were converging on a point of no return. And in that instant, Bradley Thompson was setting himself up for the single most devastating mistake of his life. The lobby fell silent in the split second after the strike. Margaret's head snapped sideways from the force of the blow, her cheek reddening almost instantly. The sound echoed like a whip crack through the marble hall, shocking the bystanders into stillness. Some gasped, others froze in disbelief. Officer Bradley Thompson, breathing hard, allowed a flicker of satisfaction to cross his face. For him, this was dominance reasserted. But Margaret did not collapse, nor did she retreat. Slowly, deliberately, she straightened, her eyes steady and her voice calm. "That," she said, her tone sharp enough to slice through the hush, "was a mistake." The words rang louder than the strike itself. A ripple of murmurs surged through the onlookers. Thompson's confidence faltered, if only for a second. He expected outrage, perhaps tears, but not this controlled defiance. Margaret reached into her briefcase, not with haste, but with the steady composure of someone entirely certain of her ground. From inside, she produced a slim leather case and snapped it open. In her hand was an official federal identification card, embossed and unmistakable. She held it up for everyone, including Thompson, to see. "I am Judge Margaret Sullivan," she declared, her voice carrying across the lobby. "Chief Justice of the Davidson County Superior Court." The words hit Thompson harder than any slap could. His jaw slackened, his bravado draining as the crowd erupted in whispers. He blinked rapidly, trying to process what he had just heard. The woman he had mocked, belittled, and struck was no ordinary visitor. She was the highest-ranking judicial officer in the county, his superior in the very system he served. Before Thompson could stammer a reply, another voice cut through the air. "Judge Sullivan!" Janet Morrison, the courthouse's chief clerk, hurried forward, her heels clattering against the marble floor. She stopped at Margaret's side, her face pale with shock. "Are you all right?" she asked, then spun toward Thompson with outrage blazing in her eyes. "Officer Thompson, what have you done?" The crowd was no longer silent. Gasps, whispers, and even a few angry shouts filled the space. Several people had pulled out their phones, recording the unfolding scene. The officer who had always carried himself with untouchable authority was now exposed, cornered in front of dozens of witnesses. Thompson's lips trembled as he searched for words. I didn't know. I thought—" "You thought I was powerless," Margaret interrupted, her tone rising just enough to command the room. "You believed you could treat me with contempt, humiliate me, even strike me, because you assumed no one would stop you." She turned, meeting the eyes of the gathered spectators. "But today, in front of this courthouse, in front of these people, you have proven exactly why this abuse of power cannot be ignored." Janet nodded sharply, her voice ringing with authority. "As chief clerk of this court, I confirm the identity of Judge Margaret Sullivan, and I also confirm that what just occurred was an unprovoked assault on a sitting judge." Thompson staggered back a step, his face blanching. "Wait, this isn't— I didn't mean—" Margaret's hand lifted, silencing him. "Officer Bradley Thompson," she said with quiet force, "you are under arrest for assaulting a federal judge." The lobby erupted. Some gasped again, others clapped, and a few simply stared, stunned by the reversal of power. Two sheriff's deputies, alerted by the commotion, moved quickly to Margaret's side. She nodded to them with calm authority. "Escort Officer Thompson into custody," she ordered. The deputies exchanged brief looks, shock, disbelief, and then swift obedience. They stepped forward, taking hold of Thompson's arms. The officer who had minutes earlier strutted with arrogant confidence now struggled like a trapped animal. His protest spilled out in panicked fragments. "This is a misunderstanding. I didn't know. I thought she was lying." But the more he shouted, the clearer it became to everyone that this was not confusion. It was exposure. His abuse of authority had been laid bare under the brightest possible light. Margaret, still standing tall, brushed her hand lightly across her cheek, where the sting of his strike lingered. But her gaze was steady, her resolve unshaken. "Take him," she repeated firmly. As Thompson was led away, his voice cracked in desperation. "Judge Sullivan, please give me a chance to explain." She did not answer. Her silence was its own verdict. For those gathered in the lobby, the message was unmistakable. Power misused is power lost. And in the span of a few short minutes, the man who once believed himself untouchable was dragged away in handcuffs, while the woman he had tried to diminish stood revealed as the very embodiment of justice. The following morning, the Davidson County Courthouse was more crowded than anyone could remember. Word of the incident in the lobby had spread like wildfire, through staff, attorneys, journalists, and even ordinary citizens who had heard whispers of what had transpired. People lined the corridors, pressing close to the heavy oak doors of Courtroom 1, eager to witness what many were already calling a reckoning. Inside, the chamber buzzed with hushed conversations. Reporters filled every available bench, their notebooks and cameras poised. Lawyers whispered speculations to each other, clerks shuffled nervously with files, and curious onlookers clutched at the opportunity to see the aftermath of a security officer striking a federal judge. The atmosphere was electric, a blend of outrage, disbelief, and anticipation. At precisely 9 o'clock, the door behind the bench opened. Judge Margaret Sullivan entered, clad in her black robes. The sight of her silenced the room immediately. Though her face still bore a faint bruise from the slap, her presence radiated calm authority. She moved with deliberate grace, ascending to her seat and adjusting her glasses before surveying the courtroom. "All rise," the bailiff announced. The entire room stood. "Please be seated," Sullivan said, her voice clear and steady. The gavel struck once, echoing like a reminder that order still reigned in this house of law. At the defense table sat Bradley Thompson. The swagger he had displayed in the lobby was gone. His uniform had been replaced with a plain suit, ill-fitting and wrinkled. His face was pale, his eyes shadowed by sleeplessness. Beside him, his court-appointed attorney, Michael Green, leaned close, whispering urgently. Thompson nodded mutely, his hands twisting together in his lap. Prosecutor Angela Ramirez rose first, her posture upright, her expression sharp. She addressed the court. "Your Honor, we are here to try the case of Officer Bradley Thompson, charged with assault on a federal judge, abuse of authority, and conduct unbecoming of an officer sworn to protect the court. The evidence is indisputable. The incident was witnessed by dozens, recorded by multiple cameras, and corroborated by the victim herself, this court's own Chief Justice." She allowed the weight of her words to settle before continuing. "This is not merely a case about one officer losing his temper. It is about the misuse of power, the betrayal of trust, and the failure to recognize that respect is not optional within these halls. If an officer cannot restrain his prejudice, his arrogance, and his hand when dealing with the highest officer of this court, then how can the public believe they are safe?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the spectators. When Ramirez sat down, defense attorney Green rose. His voice was careful, measured. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the court, my client admits to making a grave mistake. He has acknowledged the slap. He has expressed remorse. But let us consider the context. Officer Thompson did not act out of malice toward Judge Sullivan personally. He did not even recognize her. He was enforcing security protocol in a tense environment. He believed, however mistakenly, that he was protecting the courthouse. We asked the court to view this act not as an assault born of hatred, but as an error in judgment by a man under stress. Thompson's shoulders sagged as his lawyer spoke, his eyes fixed on the table. Judge Sullivan regarded both sides silently for a moment, then said, "We will hear witness testimony, one by one." Witnesses took the stand. Janet Morrison, the clerk, described arriving at the lobby in time to see Sullivan struck. "I have worked with Judge Sullivan for 15 years, she testified firmly. She is always calm, always professional. There was no provocation. What I saw was not enforcement of rules. It was humiliation, deliberate and unjust. Other clerks and attorneys echoed similar accounts. Even visitors to the courthouse, ordinary citizens, told the same story. A security officer consumed by arrogance, a woman treated with disdain, a slap that silenced the room. Each testimony tightened the noose around Thompson's defense. Finally, the moment came for Margaret Sullivan herself to speak. She rose from the bench and, in an unusual but legally permitted move, stepped into the witness box. The bailiff swore her in. "Judge Sullivan," Ramirez began gently, "can you describe what happened that morning in your own words?" Margaret's voice was calm, unwavering. "I entered the courthouse as I have thousands of times before. I complied with security protocol. When the detector beeped, I explained that I carried only legal documents. Officer Thompson demanded to see them. I complied. He rifled through them, accused me of theft, and when I insisted upon my legitimacy, he struck me across the face." She paused, her eyes meeting the jury. "It was not the physical pain that shocked me, it was the disrespect. Not to me as Margaret Sullivan, but to the very office I hold. To strike a judge is to strike at justice itself. In that moment, every person in that lobby saw an officer abuse power in the place where power must be restrained most of all." Her words settled heavily into the air. Reporters scribbled furiously, sensing history crystallizing in front of them. Defense attorney Green attempted a cross-examination, but his questions faltered. Each time he tried to cast Thompson's actions as a misunderstanding, Sullivan's measured replies dismantled his argument. "Misunderstanding does not require violence," she repeated more than once. By afternoon, closing statements began. Ramirez's words were searing. "When those sworn to protect justice become its violators, the very foundation of this courthouse trembles. Today you must decide whether authority excuses abuse or whether respect is the cornerstone of law." Green appealed for mercy. "Bradley Thompson is not a monster. He is a man who made a mistake that cost him dearly. He has apologized, and he asks for a chance to rebuild his life." The jury deliberated only 2 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood, hands steady. "We find the defendant guilty on all counts." A hush fell. Thompson buried his face in his hands. Judge Sullivan returned to the bench. Her gavel struck. "Officer Bradley Thompson," she said, her tone even but firm, "you are hereby sentenced to 6 months in federal custody, followed by community service and mandatory training in bias recognition and professional conduct. This court does not delight in punishment, but justice demands accountability. Authority is not a shield from consequence. It is a duty to serve with humility." The chamber erupted in whispers as the bailiffs moved to escort Thompson away. The man who once lauded power over others now walked shackled, humbled before the very justice he had dishonored. As the crowd slowly dispersed, one truth echoed in every mind. Justice had not only been defended that day, it had been defined. The gavel's echo still lingered when Judge Sullivan straightened in her chair, her gaze fixed firmly on the man before her. The courtroom was hushed, every eye on Officer Bradley Thompson. His shoulders sagged, his face pale, his bravado long gone. "Officer Thompson," she began, her voice deliberate, "I want you to understand something very clearly. The reason you are sitting in that defendant's chair is not because you failed to recognize me as a judge. You are there because you chose violence against a person you assumed had no power. That is the truth of this matter." Thompson swallowed hard. For the first time, his eyes betrayed fear, not just of punishment, but of shame. He tried to speak, but Sullivan's raised hand silenced him. She leaned forward slightly, her words striking sharper than any blow. "In 12 years of courthouse security, how many times have you turned a routine interaction into a confrontation? How many times have you escalated instead of de-escalating?" "I already know the answer," she continued, lifting a document from the bench. Your personnel file records 14. Complaints for excessive force, 14. And yet today is the first time you are truly facing consequences. The murmur that rippled through the gallery was one of shock and disapproval. Thompson's attorney looked stricken. Thompson himself seemed to shrink in his chair, his uniform no longer a symbol of authority, but of failure. Judge Sullivan rose from her seat and stepped out from behind the bench. Her robes swept across the floor as she addressed not only the defendant, but everyone in the packed room. Ladies and gentlemen, what happened this morning in our courthouse is not about a single officer and a single mistake. It is about the way authority can be abused when no one is watching. Officer Thompson did not strike me because I broke any law. He struck me because he thought no one would hold him accountable. That, above all, is unacceptable. The silence in the room was absolute. Every lawyer, clerk, and spectator understood the weight of her words. Sullivan's gaze softened, though her tone remained firm. Justice is not confined to what happens inside this courtroom. It begins the moment someone walks through these doors. Every citizen, whether a plumber, a teacher, or a judge, deserves the same dignity and respect. Power does not excuse cruelty. Uniforms do not excuse violence. Authority is not a license to demean. Returning to her bench, she placed both hands on the wood and looked directly at Thompson. This court will not ignore what you did, but more importantly, this court will not allow the culture that made you believe this was acceptable to continue unchecked. Accountability begins now. Thompson bowed his head. The truth of her words, undeniable and devastating, left him with nothing to hide behind. The lesson was clear. True justice is blind, not to identity, not to appearance, but to the arrogance of those who mistake power for permission. The courthouse itself had transformed. Under Judge Margaret Sullivan's directives, new security protocols were firmly in place. Every interaction at the security checkpoint was recorded, every use of force automatically reviewed by a civilian oversight board, and every officer was trained to treat citizens not as potential threats but as individuals deserving dignity. Visitors noticed the difference immediately. What had once been an intimidating gauntlet of suspicion now felt like a gateway to justice, marked by fairness and respect. Ironically, one of the most powerful advocates for these changes was none other than Officer Bradley Thompson. After serving his 6-month jail sentence, he began the long road of restitution. Instead of vanishing into obscurity, he embraced the responsibility Judge Sullivan had demanded of him. Thompson spoke candidly at police academies, training seminars, and community forums across the country. He told his own story, how unchecked arrogance and unconscious bias had led him to cross a line that cost him everything. His message was simple yet sobering. The moment authority is abused, it ceases to be authority at all. Meanwhile, Judge Sullivan's actions had sparked a nationwide conversation. Newspapers praised her for her composure and her reforms. Legal scholars cited the incident as a turning point in courthouse culture. Letters poured into her chambers from ordinary citizens who had experienced disrespect, intimidation, or worse at the hands of officials, but had never possessed the power to challenge it. To them, Sullivan's stand was more than a personal victory. It was proof that accountability was possible, even within the highest walls of justice. The bruise on her cheek had faded within days, but the lessons of that October morning endured. A bronze plaque installed near the courthouse's main entrance at her request carried the words, "Respect begins here. Justice starts now." It served as a daily reminder that justice is not a performance reserved for the courtroom. It is a practice, lived out in the first greeting, the first security check, the first moment a citizen enters the halls of law. Sullivan often reflected on how close that morning had come to being just another incident swept aside, one more example of silent injustice. Instead, it became the catalyst for lasting change. She knew the work was not finished. Change never truly is. But the foundation had been laid. The story of Judge Sullivan and Officer Thompson became more than a local scandal. It became a symbol. It reminded people that respect is not conditional on titles, uniforms, or appearances. Respect is the right of every human being. True authority, she often reminded others, does not come from the ability to punish, but from the wisdom to protect. And so, long after the echo of that gavel faded, the lesson lived on: justice at its purest, is blind to status and power, but never blind to truth.